So welcome everyone. I really am excited to talk birdie with you today. I get to talk birdie almost every day, which is always a lot of fun. So what I'd hope to do today is to be able to share with you a little bit about the birds in your backyard. As Helen nicely said, I have been doing this for over 30 years now. I am not an ornithologist by trade. Everything I've learned about birds, I've learned through what we call OJT, or on-the-job training. One of the interesting facts for me, at least, particularly when my husband and I were looking at starting this business more than 30 years ago, is that even today, by dollar value, bird watching is the second largest hobby in the United States in terms of money spent, whether that's going out on birding trips or buying birdseed to feed the birds in your own backyard. The number one hobby is gardening. So for today, what I'd like to do is share some fun facts that I've learned over the years about the birds in our backyard and some information you may not know about some of your favorite backyard songbirds. I'll talk a little bit also about how you can attract them, what they eat, and what they have to sing to us. I'm going to start off, I think, with almost everyone's favorite bird. We all have favorite birds, but this is the state bird of Massachusetts, as you're probably aware. It is the black-capped chickadee. Now, I love chickadees. They're very, very cute and sweet. And my husband was often fond of saying that when you put out a bird feeder, they're generally one of the first birds to come to a feeder. What I can tell you about them is that, birds hunt by sight, as do the chickadees. What's really interesting is when birds hunt by sight, they find bird food a couple of different ways. They find it by observing other birds doing what they call feeding behavior, at a feeder, or gee, that looks like Harry's eating something. I'm going to go check it out. And they find a food source. And the other way that they find food, besides watching others find food, is by the brightness of the seed. Birds are really cool. They can see in the ultraviolet spectrum. You and I, as humans, don't see very well in that spectrum, but they do. And sunflower and safflower and other food that they like actually has an oil content, and it's shiny, and they get to see that through the ultraviolet. And so the brighter it is, the shinier it is, the fresher the food is, which I think is really kind of cool. Birds do not hunt by smell. They don't smell their food, they see it. There are some exceptions to birds in terms of hunting by smell. The big exception are carrion eaters, things like turkey vultures and whatnot, because they have to smell the dead and dying roadkill or whatever's been left. One of the really cool adaptations that I love about the vultures is that they don't have any head feathers. And that's because they're sticking their heads into the guts of animals, and they would have a hard time preening, so they don't have any head feathers. One of the really cool adaptations. Besides being the state bird of Massachusetts, and a really cute one, when black-capped chickadees sing, they're what we call namesayers. So they say their name. So it would be chickadee-dee-dee-dee-dee, chickadee-dee-dee-dee-dee. So you've probably heard that a lot in your yard. What I love and I found very fascinating about chickadees is that when you listen for that song or that call, the number of D's that you hear equates to whether or not they feel a threat. So if they're, if they're just hanging out in your backyard and they're having a good time, you might hear chickadee-dee or maybe chickadee-dee-dee. But if there's a threat, if there's a predator, if there's a hawk, if there's a cat, they're going to extend the number of D's. So it might be chickadee-dee-dee-dee-dee-dee. So you listen to that, you'll be able to find out what's going on in the environment. I love to tell the story of my husband and I back when we were living in Boston. We were driving actually to come to the store, and there was a chickadee up on a branch, and it was singing, and my husband started singing back to it in the chickadee-dee-dee song. And oh my gosh, the little bird kept getting all puffed up and was singing the dee-dee-dee-dee-dee-dee-dee-dees very long. And I finally looked at my husband and said, "Quit bothering the chickadee, leave him alone." But it was a fun moment to have. Now, these little guys are what I like to call hit and run eaters. They don't eat out of feeder. They don't eat where they find their food. They take the seed, they fly away. They either cache it for later or they eat it and come back. So they're constantly doing a hit and run. They can cache for later up to 200 seeds in a day. What is really fascinating to me is that this bird adapts over time. Come fall and winter, they really do cache a lot of food because they want to know, that they have good food sources for the winter. So what they'll do is they'll take a seed or a nut and they'll go and they'll fly off and they'll find it and they'll put it behind a knot hole. They'll put it behind bark. They've even been known to put it behind shingles in someone's house. But then what they do is they stare at it and they look at it and they memorize where it is. Okay, big deal. But what's really a big deal is their brain actually expands in winter to hold all this information about where the food they have cached is located. And I just find that fascinating that their brains actually get larger because they need that space. I wish my brain got larger because Lord knows I could use more space to remember things. Then over the winter, as we get into spring right now, their hippocampus, which is the part of the brain that enlarges, actually shrinks back and it kind of cleans the disc so that for the next season when they start caching food, they can, start all over again with a clean slate, so to speak. Chickadees are what I would call a rude diner in the sense that they are one of the few backyard songbirds that actually use their feet to eat, in the sense that they'll take a seed, they'll take a nut, and as you can see, we have these very long, strong talons, and they'll actually put the seed between the talons and wail away at it to crack it open or to make the nut meat smaller to eat. This is really much more of a hawk-like feeding behavior where they hold down their prey and eat it. This is not universal among backyard songbirds. So I find that kind of an interesting thing. You've probably heard the expression that, I know it's going to rain because I can feel it in my bones. Birds do have the ability to feel incoming bad weather, and it has to do with their middle ear and what it detects barometric pressure shifts. So with an approaching storm, they will feel heavier because they can feel the barometric change in their brains and they know, okay, a storm is coming. I'm going to load up on food. I have a friend who tells me that rather than listening to the weathermen about how bad a storm is going to be, particularly if they don't know, or there's all kind of conflicting numbers, 2 inches of snow, 5 inches of snow, no snow, she always observes the birds at her feeder. And depending upon how heavily they're feeding, that's how she gauges how bad the storm is going to be. And I thought that was an interesting way of looking at the weather. So, they can be our own little weathermen. So this is my personal favorite bird. It is perky, it is cute, and it is the tufted titmouse. As you can see, that great tuft is very prominent, hence the name. Now, this bird does not sing its name, but rather it sings another name. It sings Peter, Peter, Peter. So it's going to go Peter, 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 Peter. So if you hear someone and it sounds like they're calling the name Peter, look out for titmice. Like the chickadee, this bird also does takeaway dining, finds food such as that yummy peanut there and takes it off, caches it or eats it and comes back. It is the other songbird that we have that actually also uses its feet to eat. Once again, it holds the seed between its talons and wails away at it to make it smaller to be able to eat. That's how they do it. The crest does have a function. If you really are watching these birds in your backyard, what I would recommend is looking to see, particularly if you have groups of titmice, who has their crest up and who has their crest down. If the tuft is up, it is actually a dominant bird. If the tuft is down, it is a submissive bird. I think it's a really cool thing to look at when you're watching and observing their behavior out in your yard. There are benefits to being a dominant bird because it generally means that you're going to have access to the best food first and be safe from predators, as the more submissive or non-dominant titmice tend to feed on the outside and they're on the inside, and feeding on the edge of the flock, you're more vulnerable to predation than you are if you're feeding from the center. of the flock. Then we have what I love to refer to as the upside down bird. It's the nuthatch. This is just like the species we've talked about before, the chickadees and the titmice. You cannot really tell the males from the females because they both look the same. In nuthatches, if you look really closely, you can tell the difference, but sometimes it's hard if you're not seeing them side by side. If you look at this, this is a male, and I know it's a male because his forefront here is very, very dark. On the females, it's going to be a lesser shade of black. It's going to be much lighter, so you can see the difference between the males and the females. This bird always sounds to me like it's laughing at me when I'm out in my backyard, because it goes, and I'm thinking, okay, who's laughing at me? What am I doing? Who's making fun of me? And it's usually my little friend here, the white-breasted nuthatch. Now, this guy is called the upside down bird because its talons are different than some of its other songbird brethren. And it's kind of hard, unfortunately, to see in this photo, but it has a very long hind toe with a curved claw. And because of that, when it's on the tree and clinging to the bark, it only needs one toe to stay safely secured to a tree. I find that really fun and interesting to know. Once again, a hit and run diner. But I like to say, look, ma, no feet. Unlike the chickadees and the titmice, white-breasted nuthatches don't use their feet to eat. What they do is they will take the seed, or they will take a nut or whatever they're eating, and they will hide it behind or put it behind a piece of bark or something that they will hold it in place for them, and then they whack against it very hard to open it. So, you know, look, ma, no feet. They're a more polite diner and more like our other backyard songbirds in that they don't use their feet. One of my favorite things about the white-breasted nuthatch, and I'm really excited because I just think nature is really cool and neat, is that this bird goes down a tree head first. Now, when you've ever observed woodpeckers in particular going down a tree, they go down a tree tail first. And what I love about this is that I often think of the nuthatches I spy with my eye. They can both eat from the same tree and find food on the same tree, but they're finding different food. And it has to do with their perspective. Because the nuthatch is coming head down, it's seeing and finding different food that the woodpecker that's going tail down first cannot find, and vice versa. So they can live very symbiotically and find food in the same tree without competing for resources because they're finding them in different ways. And I just think that is such a cool thing. I would love to be able to go head first down a tree and see what I could spy. So these guys I like to kind of group together, and I usually say chickadees and nuthatches and titmice. Oh my, they all like a similar food. Their main favorite food is going to be sunflower, because what it does is it mimics the kinds of seeds they're going to find in trees naturally, such as pine and hemlock, spruce, fir, maple, elm trees, etc. All those trees have seeds, and sunflower mimics that. Sunflower comes in 3 different kinds. The most popular is black oil sunflower. There's also striped sunflower, and then there is sunflower chips, which is just sunflower without the shell, so it's just the meat. Now, when I started this business 30 years ago, what interested me was that 97 to 98% of the crops of sunflowers that are grown in the United States are grown for human consumption. Striped sunflower is grown as confectioner's sunflower. So if you go into a health food store or go into your Shaw's or local supermarket and you buy a bag of sunflower chips to eat, that is striped sunflower. The sunflower is much larger. It's got a really hard shell, and crack it open and it stays whole, and it's really, good to eat. Black oil sunflower, which is a much smaller and shinier seed, it's a higher oil content seed, that's actually grown and pressed for cooking oil. when you go into a supermarket and you buy vegetable oil, it's either soybean oil or sunflower oil. And what they do when they process it is that they just crush it shell and all, and the oil leaches out. So bird feeding only represents about 3% of the industry. And I was fascinated by that, that it's really not, grown for the birds, it's grown for us, and they are the happy beneficiaries of the leftovers. Safflower is another great way to feed these guys. Safflower is a white oil seed. It's grown out in the Midwest, and it's pressed for cooking oil that you can buy next door. One of the things that is very popular about safflower is members of the blackbird family, such as grackles and starlings, and even squirrels don't tend to like it very much. So a lot of my customers like to feed it because it's a way of feeding birds and minimizing squirrel activity or large blackbird activity. The challenge becomes, because it's not native to New England and birds aren't used to finding it when they naturally forage for food in the forest, that it might take them a while to get used to having it in their diet. But once they do, they're very happy and they will eat it readily. You can put them in a variety of different feeders, like a tube feeder or a hopper feeder. And I'd like to show you a couple of things. This is what I have behind me back here. First off, let me just show you, if you're not familiar with what bird food looks like, and I suspect you all are, the tiny black seed, or the black seed is black oil sunflower. The white seed that you see here is safflower seed. And this particular blend has a little bit of striped in it. It's maybe a little difficult to see. It's a slightly larger seed. And then in this blend, we also have white proso millet, which is the tiny little tan seed. And birds up at the feeder level, like these three guys we're talking about, don't like the millet, but it's designed to be kicked out to the ground for ground feeders who do prefer it, like the sparrows and mourning doves. This is an example of a feeder that you could put that kind of seed in that these birds will eat from. This is just a tube style feeder where the food goes in the top and the food comes out here and the birds can perch on these little perches right here. When you have a tube feeder like this, without a tray on the bottom, it tends to be for smaller birds, like the three we've been talking about. But by adding a tray, you can do a couple of things. You can catch the seed that falls, but you can also give larger birds like your cardinals and blue jays a place to land. Another style of feeder to use is just a hopper feeder or a house style feeder. Lift up, fill it, and whoever can land on these ledges, big birds or small birds, happily feed. And this holds quite a lot of food, so you don't have to refill it as often. We all have an opportunity to go for the gold, even if we can't compete in the Olympics, because we can go for the gold by attracting beautiful goldfinches to our backyard. As you can see, this is a male in its summer plumage, its mating plumage, and you can understand why it's often referred to as the wild canary, because it really does look like a canary, that bright, bright yellow. Goldfinches are one of our only backyard songbirds who actually molt fully twice a year, the other being the European starling. Because, as you know, men in the bird world have to attract the mates, track them. And there are a variety of ways that male birds do that. Some do it by song, some literally do it by dance. In the case of the American goldfinch, it's by wearing that bright yellow jacket, because in the bird world, men do wear the makeup. This guy, when he is singing, it sounds like the song, potato chip, potato chip. They like eating potato chips. No, they don't, but that's what their call sounds like. And what's really cool is when they are flying across, you can often spy them in your yard without actually seeing them up close, because they have this kind of U-dip pattern that they fly across the yard with. So it's a very distinctive flight pattern. Now, unlike some of our other backyard songbirds that vary their diet quite a bit with seeds and nuts and even protein such as insects, particularly when they're feeding their young, American goldfinch are really some of the strictest, they're vegetarians. That's all they eat. They will not eat protein to feed their young. For example, most birds will find mealworms or other worms or bugs and eat it and regurgitate it to their young because it's a very high protein food. These guys don't do that. And in fact, they wait until the end of the year breeding season, July and August, to nest, so that by the time their nestlings leave and have hatched and are flying, the seeds from the flowers have already gone to seed, the weeds have gone to seed, and they have something to feed their young because they're not looking for insects to do so. So that's kind of a cool adaptation, that they wait so long to be able to do that. These guys are very acrobatic feeders, and unlike a lot of your general seed feeders that do takeaway dining, goldfinches love to dine in at the restaurant. They love to just sit on every available perch of a finch feeder and eat and eat and eat and eat and eat. They're also very acrobatic when they feed. I often say that they can eat standing on their head, which they can, because they actually will cling upside down to flower stalks and things and to get the seeds out. So where there's a will, there's a way, and they will figure out how to feed. This is the one bird that I've never quite understood how we found out that they actually like what I would call Indian food or African food, because one of their favorite foods is Niger, also known as thistle, and that it's the only seed that we feed Native American birds that is not native to this country. It is imported mainly right now from Ethiopia and India and Niger. Back when I was starting, it was also imported from Burma. And in these countries, it is grown as an oil crop. And much like we do with our black oil sunflower, they crush it. Countries like India crush it, shell and all, for the oil for cooking. So I don't know how they figured out that our Native American birds would like it, but they certainly do. So let me just show you a couple of the feeders that you might want to use to attract the goldfinches with thistle. Because thistle is such a small, tiny seed, it's very, 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 very tiny. And it is more expensive because it is not native to this country and it costs a little more. The industry has actually created specific feeders for the thistle. And as you, hopefully you can see, it has very, very tiny holes so that the food doesn't fall out and the birds can actually pull it out. As you can see, this one has 3 perches on it for 6 spots, and it would not be uncommon to see all 6 perches full of these bright yellow goldfinches eating away, which is really a fun sight to see and very cheery to see. Another kind of feeder that they will use is a mesh style feeder. And this is, well, they'll cling right to it to feed, much like they'd cling to a stalk of a flower, a coneflower or whatnot, to feed from the seeds from that. So this allows them to cling. Even though they're beautiful, they're sometimes a little feisty and they will fight at a feeder. There's always pecking order squabbles because much like the tufted titmouse with its crest up, it's dominant. There are alpha males and females in their goldfinch flocks, and they're always going to try to be at the top. They want to be on top. So a feeder like this tends to decrease pecking order squabbles, and it's often fun to see them hanging upside down and in all different kinds of positions. Thistle actually mimics, we talked about how sunflower mimics the seeds that our chickadees and titmice and nuthatches normally find. The thistle actually mimics weedy flowers with small seeds like goldenrod and ragweed. The other food that you can use, and something that we're finding in our store is becoming very, very popular, is not just straight Niger seed or thistle, but something called finch mix, which is actually a blend of 2 of the favorite foods of goldfinches, and that is the thistle and sunflower chips, which is sunflower without the shell. And it's been ground down fine so it'll fit through the openings on these feeders. And this seems to be a trend that is nationwide and not just located to New England, in that for some reason their tastes have changed over time and thistle is less and less their favorite and more the sunflower chips, which is very interesting that their diet is changing, but it seems to be, and it may have to do with the protein and oil content of the sunflower versus the Niger. We don't know, but we're going to feed them what they like to eat. Woodpeckers. And my question is, wouldn't you like to be a woodpecker? In the wood, most of our woodpeckers, not all of them, are black and white. In this one, I know it is a downy woodpecker, and I know it's a male because, once again, in the bird world, men wear the makeup. So this is a male because you can see that red spot on the back of the head. Now, downies and hairies look exactly alike except for size. Downy woodpeckers are about 6 inches in length and hairy woodpeckers are about 9 inches in length. But the other way you can tell is the beak. On a downy woodpecker, the beak is about half the width of the head. But in a hairy woodpecker, the beak is much longer and it is actually the width of the head. One of my fun little facts I love about woodpeckers is that I love watching juvenile woodpecker behavior, and they can be particularly dim, baby woodpeckers. But I love the little boy woodpeckers because what happens is once they've fledged, they do have a red spot, but I find this fascinating. The red spot is actually on the top of their noggins. And as they continue to grow and get bigger and their skulls grow, that red spot moves from the top of the head to the back of their skull. Who knew? Very cool. Now we've talked a little bit, and I've done my best to give you some examples of calls of birds. Woodpeckers, they don't really have a song. They're what I would call the headbangers of the bird world, where goldfinches, put on a beautiful yellow jacket to attract a female, or other birds might sing a gorgeous song. These guys pound because they don't have a good song. They don't sing. So you've probably heard it. You've probably heard it on your house. This time of year, you might hear a lot of drumming, and that is how they attract a mate. What they do is they'll find a very resonant surface. On my house in Milford, it happens to be my metal gutters, but they find a very resonant surface and they bang on it. And what they're doing is they're sounding out their territory, and they're just saying, hi, I'm the biggest, baddest woodpecker in the territory. This is mine. And it's also a way of attracting a mate. You've probably heard it. I've woken up, even when I was living in the city of Boston, I would wake up and I would honestly think in spring that they were out jackhammering the roadway for a construction project. Come to find out it was a woodpecker on the roof, sounding out their territory. All of our songbirds are uniquely designed, but I think woodpeckers are have particularly interesting physiology. One of the questions that I'm often asked is, with all that pounding that they do, doesn't their beak wear down? Well, actually it does, but they have special cells at the tip of their beak that is constantly replenishing the lost material. It helps to keep the chisel point strong, and actually every time they strike, it sharpens their beak, which is really kind of cool. I'm going to show you another woodpecker, and this guy is the red-bellied woodpecker, not a red-headed, but a red-bellied woodpecker. Hard to see in this photo, but there is a tiny hint of blush on the belly. And when they were actually originally naming birds, and you went out bird watching back in the 1800s, you would actually shoot birds and put them in a specimen tray. That's how people bird watched or did studies. And this is the only member of the woodpecker family that has red on the belly, hence the name red-bellied. This is a male because the male has an entire red head. And I love it because it's that kind of bright orangey red that's distinct from the downy woodpecker red and the red-headed woodpecker red. It's just very vibrant. Unlike the downies and hairies, females also have, red-bellies also have red on their head. But what they'll have is they'll have the red here and the red between their eyes, but they're gray. They will have a top knot. One of the adaptations that woodpeckers have is they have extremely stiff tail feathers. And what that does is it allows them to get support on a tree to prop up their weight so that they can dig and hunt for bugs in crevices of the bark of the tree. So it gives them leverage to really be able to peck. So they use these very stiff tail feathers as a third leg for leverage. When they're trying to find insects and bugs and things in the wood, The tip of their tongue is actually barbed, and it's very sensitive to touch, and it helps them to detect and impale insect larvae. Their tongue is actually coated with a sticky mucus so that they can ensure that their insect prey doesn't get away. Yum. In terms of positioning, their tongue is so long that when it is retracted in their bodies, it actually wraps around the back of their skulls. It helps to provide some shock absorption when they're banging, but it's a very long tongue that wraps up behind here to help protect them. Which is pileated or pileated. Either way is appropriate. Woodpecker, our largest woodpecker here in North America. This is a male because you can see the red mustache. And these markings, if a bird does have markings around the bill, it is a mustache. And so the females will also have a red on their head, but they will lack the red mustache. Woodpeckers are one of the very few birds that have what they call, and I'm going to read this because I haven't memorized it, zygodactyl feet, meaning they have 2 toes going forward and 2 toes going backward. And what that does, because they have these 2 sets of opposing toes, it allows them to get a much better grip on the tree to climb up and down. When they're pecking, not only are they using their very stiff tail feathers as a third leg, but their nostrils also have tufts of stiff feathers coming across them. So as they're excavating, they're not inhaling debris, which I think is kind of cool. When they are pecking at a tree, particularly to excavate, they can hit with a force of about 15 miles an hour. Wow. One of my fun facts that I love sharing, particularly with little kids because they find it fascinating and kind of gross, and so do I, is when a woodpecker is striking a tree trunk, every time it hits, it closes its eyelids. Not only does it have the stiff tail feathers to protect from inhaling the debris, but by closing its eyes, it's making sure that its eyeballs don't fly right out of their sockets, because they would, because they're hitting with such force. These guys are easy to, not pileated woodpeckers necessarily, but woodpeckers as a family are fairly easy to attract to your backyard. And their favorite thing is to eat suet. Suet replicates the insect larvae that they normally eat because it's high in protein and fat. Suet is traditionally made from fat from around a beef kidney, and it's rendered down. All the hair follicles and impurities are taken out of the suet, and then goodies are mixed in, like fruit or nuts or seeds or even bugs like mealworms. And it's a great way to, just put it in a little feeder and hang out and see who comes. They're lots of fun to have in your yard. The other thing that they love to eat are peanuts. And so you can provide peanuts in the shell or out of the shell. They would probably prefer out of the shell, although they certainly have the bills to strike to crack open a shell. And we also have, pardon me for turning around, we also have peanut feeders where they will just cling, just like they would cling to a tree trunk. They'll cling right to the feeder and eat the peanuts very happily. And peanuts, we're talking about the food that we're feeding them, how it replicates their natural food. Peanuts mimic acorns and pine nuts that they would eat. So it's just, another way to supplement their diet and replicate what they're eating naturally in nature. And that's one point I should make, is that I often get questions from customers about, should I feed, should I not feed? Am I going to stop them from migrating? Am I going to will they not learn how to find food on their own? We only supplement their diet when we put out food like suet or peanuts or sunflower. We only supplement a bird's natural diet by about 80%. 20%. 80% of the time, they're foraging for food naturally. We're only supplementing their diet a little bit. Now, this guy, I think from my customer's perspective, you either love him or you hate him. But you know, really, blue jays are not all that bad. They have a bad rap. They are a real alarmist, is what I would say. If you know that all different kinds of groupings of birds have, or animals in particular, have different names, like a pride of lions, it happens to be a charm of goldfinches. For blue jays, it's a gang. They're a gang of blue jays. And I often think that's very appropriate because I kind of picture a group of them together wearing their leather jackets and their, you know, their biker chains and riding motorcycles. But they really have a function in my backyard and in everyone's backyard. They are what I would call the sentinels of the bird world. They keep an eye out, and they often are the first ones to let other birds in the area know there's danger, whether it's a cat or a hawk or a snake or whatever kind of predator might be around. They're going to sound the alarm and let everyone know, hence the name alarmist. They are extremely bright. These guys are actually members of the blackbird family, and blackbirds as a whole are extremely smart. These guys feed a little differently than others that might take a seed, fly off and eat it, or cache it, or actually eat right at the feeder like the goldfinches. These birds actually have a crop that they fill. So they will stuff their crop with seed, they'll fly off, they'll spit it up, cache it, and then come back and get more seeds. Just like all these other birds that know where they've cached their food, so do blue jays. I mean, we all know where our favorite restaurants are. They know where they've stashed their food. If I were to ask, how many seeds do you think they could stuff in their crop at one time? There's actually ornithological students who have studied this, and they can stuff their crops with anywhere from 50 to 100 seeds at one time. No wonder if you have these guys in your backyard, your feeder may empty more quickly. They're taking a lot of it in one sitting. They love acorns. That is their major food source, or one of their major food sources in the wild. What I love about blue jays, and I've said that they're very bright, they're members of the corvid family, is I'd like to say they weigh all their options when it comes to food. They adore peanuts in the shell, and I've actually had this experience at home, and you would probably as well if you do this in your backyard. When blue jays are presented with peanuts in the shell, they will fly down and look them, and they will literally pick up each one and put it down. Then they will make their selection and fly off, and they will do this consistently. They'll come and they'll pick each one up, choose one, and fly off. And when they did this at a study with ornithology students, they were trying to figure out what was causing them to choose a particular nut over the other peanuts in the shell. And come to find out, it was weight. What the blue jays were doing is they were actually weighing the peanuts in their bill and choosing the heaviest one first, because it was going to provide them with the most food. I think that is really neat. So you can certainly feed either peanuts out of the shell or peanuts in the shell to blue jays, and they will be very happy. You don't even need a special feeder for peanuts in the shell. When we were living in Brighton, my husband and I, he took to whistling in the morning. We lived on the 3rd floor, and he would put peanuts in the shell out on our railing. And the blue jays learned that every morning at about the same time, he would come out and whistle and put peanuts in the shell on the railing for them. Can't tell you how disconcerting it was occasionally when the time would come and he hadn't done that, and I would see a row of blue jays on our railing doing this, peering into our back windows, waiting for him to come out with the peanuts in the shell. I'm not sure who had who well trained in that relationship, but I somehow think the birds had us well trained. And finally, we're getting to spring, and I want to share with you the jewels of spring, or the ruby-throated hummingbird. This is the smallest family of birds on Earth. A ruby-throated hummingbird weighs about 3 grams or 1/10 of an ounce, and its brain is the size of a BB, to put it in perspective. I like to say they're called hummingbirds because they hum because they don't know the words. And that's a really bad dad joke, and I apologize. But unlike some calls that I could share with you, they do have a very high-pitched squeak. But honestly, when you listen to recordings of their calls that people have made, what you tend to hear is not the squeaking as much as the beating of the wings that they have. They are what I would call speed demons. They drive a fast car. They can go from perched to a top speed of 60 miles per hour almost instantly. They generally, when they travel in your backyard and flying from flower to flower, they're going somewhere between 35 and 40 miles an hour. The secret for the hummingbird's ability to be able to hover and to even fly backwards is how they beat their wings. And it's kind of hard for me to show you, but what they do is they beat it in a figure-8 pattern on its side. So think of an infinity symbol. They're doing one of these. And that kind of motion allows them to go both forwards and backwards. They beat their wings anywhere between 20 and 80 times a second, not a minute, a second. They are very fast little guys. And as a result, they're constantly feeding because they're constantly burning up energy. I don't want to say ruby-throated speak with a forked tongue, but they do have a forked tongue. It's very long, and it has actually a fork at the end of it. And when they're drinking nectar from a flower, what they do is they put that long tongue in, and then they kind of fold it up, kind of like sometimes humans can roll up their tongues, and it creates like a straw capillary action where they suck the nectar in, basically making their tongue a straw. They can take, when they're drinking nectar, particularly from a feeder, they can kind of do this, sucking of the thing at a rate of 12 to 15 times a second. So they're very fast eaters. Just like a lot of the other birds we've talked about where they know where they've cached food, ruby-throateds, they have a remarkable ability to memorize the location of their favorite foods and of their flowers. They do, as I said, they eat quite often. They eat about every 10 minutes or so. And just remember, when someone says, oh, she eats like a bird, it's not a compliment, because eating like a bird, they eat an awful lot. For the hummingbirds, nectar is a big part of their diet, which they find in flowers or in feeders that we put out. And they also eat a lot of arthropods, or small little spiders and insects that they find crawling around in the flowers. I'm often asked what kind of flowers help to attract hummingbirds. Well, all flowers have nectar. So any kind of flower, regardless of color, is going to have nectar that the hummingbirds will find attractive. But if you really want to give them their favorite thing, you want to find some flowers that are tubular in shape. Because when you think about it, not only do hummingbirds like nectar, but so do butterflies and bees. And they are competitors with the hummingbirds for the food. So if you have open-faced flowers, anybody can get to it. But if you have those tubular shaped flowers like a fuchsia or a cardinal flower or bee balm, where it's tubular in shape, they can take their long tongues up and get the nectar and drink from it. Whereas your butterflies and bees aren't going to be able to access it. So that's why we always recommend tubular flowers for the hummingbirds, because they'll be really the only ones that can drink from it. When a hummingbird takes nectar from a flower, it's going to take nature about 24 more hours to reproduce more nectar. So if you have a beautiful wildflower garden, you may see a hummingbird there for 15, 20 minutes drinking all the nectar, and then it won't be back for another 24 hours. So what we love to do is we love to supplement that, and we love to feed the hummingbirds. And what we look for is a feeder to hold nectar, because all we're replicating legitimately is the kind of sucrose solution that they're finding in nectar and flowers, which is 20%. So it's 4 parts water, 1 part sugar. And what we do is we have these great feeders that you can put the nectar in that the hummingbirds can drink from. Now, my husband was fond of saying that, when you have where a flower requires 24 hours to reproduce more nectar, this is a flower that never quits. As long as it's filled with food, it's always on, and the hummingbirds know, and that is great. One of the things that you want to be aware of if you're going to feed hummingbirds, not only do you want to use the right nectar, but they're very finicky eaters. They only like fresh food, and because it is sugar and water, in the hot weather, it can ferment and go bad. So unlike a seed feeder where you can wait until it's empty and refill it. With a nectar feeder, you really want to change it twice a week, even if nobody's coming. And then during heat waves, you want to change the nectar every other day. It is a little bit more work than a seed feeder, but I think the rewards are well worth it. And just so you know, hummingbirds, unlike your other birds that tend to feed more cooperatively, hummingbirds are very territorial. They'll find a feeder and they'll defend it against others of their own kind. Just because they're cute doesn't mean they're nice. I invite you all to come down if you feel comfortable. We are a very clean and friendly environment here. We love, as you can tell from this talk, just enjoy talking about backyard bird feeding and bird watching. We love helping to problem solve, whether it's woodpeckers on the side of your house or oftentimes, how do I feed the birds and not the squirrels? I've really enjoyed talking birdie with you today. I hope you've learned a couple of fun things. And I hope if you like that you come in and introduce yourself to us and say, I heard you at the Brown Bag series and I'd like to find out some more, or I just want to say hi. So thank you so much, guys. I've really enjoyed myself today and I hope you have as well.